Persona 5 is finally here. We've been lucky enough to be able to play the Japanese version of the game over the last several months. So while we won't be able to speak about things like the English voice acting or the localization quality, we will be able to talk about the gameplay mechanics and everything else that really should remain untouched. Although I have every confidence that Atlus is going to do an incredible job with the localization. I mean, they delayed it specifically for localization time, which is unheard of. So first off, to get this out of the way, no plot spoilers here. I'm just going to talk about some things that I like and some things that I don't like as much, as well as my recommendations for the game. Just in general, though, the story does focus on various corrupt adults with some very dark undertones. I feel like this is a darker game than Persona 4 was. So that's really all I'm going to say about the plot. So moving on to what I liked in this game. There is a lot that I liked in this game. Number one, the art style. The art style is absolutely incredible. It's really fresh and effective. I feel like it's a risky art style in that it could have felt too busy, but it doesn't. It feels very clear. It's obvious as you scroll through menus, when you're in the middle of battle. All the actions and what they're trying to draw your eye towards is very, very effective. I particularly like the character designs, the character art style, the portraits when you're in the middle of conversations with other characters. They're just leveled up from what we got in Persona 4 Golden. Little bits of animation and things here, and I really like, when there's an intense moment and there's that streak of a character's face across the screen. Little touches like that help what can sometimes feel like a stale storybook presentation to feel a little bit more engaging and interactive. The art style really, really effectively matches the tone of this game. And it permeates everything in the way the animations look, the music, and the color palettes and everything. It feels extremely well directed. It knows what it's trying to be, and it just hits the nail right on the head. For example, the persona creation system, when you're merging personas to make a new persona, it's just so intense. But it matches the visuals that they give you. It matches the art style and the tone of the entire game. Overall, the UI is absolutely amazing. Even if you're just cruising around like purchasing medicine or weapons, it's really engaging. Every menu has these background animations that accompany it. Even just flipping through the regular pause menu when I first booted up the game and the first time I paused to get into some system settings, I just flipped through the different menu options and went in and out of different menus for quite a while, just looking at all the parts that were moving. And it's super flashy, but not too in your face. I know I keep saying that, but it's really, it rides a fine line where it could have gone wrong very easily, and it didn't. The UI in battle is just really, really fast and intuitive. They keep you out of lists. And most commands just have a button assigned to them, and so you can just whip through, and there's just the visuals make sense. When you pull out your gun, you immediately see how much ammo you have right there, and it all flows so incredibly well. It's almost my favorite part of the entire game. All right, the characters. I love the characters in this game as well. In Japanese, again, because I played this in Japanese the writing's really fresh and interesting. I'm confident that Atlus will be able to bring the tone across appropriately in their localizations for this game. You really want to know more about these characters. I mean, so much of the Persona series is spent in dialogue trees and conversations with the various people that you meet. And these people make you just want more of that. You really want to know their backgrounds. You want to know what they think, where they live, and what they do, just their normal day-to-day habits. Like, you really want to know these characters. At least I did personally. So Ryuji is the Yosuke of Persona 5. I mean, he's the character who kind of balances out the emotionless protagonist a little bit. I felt in Persona 4 the protagonist was just a little too kind of stale. And obviously Yosuke was supposed to kind of emote on behalf of the protagonist without being the protagonist, so you can still have somebody that, isn't doing something that you maybe wouldn't have done, but still maybe portraying the appropriate emotion for the occasion. I don't know. I still like it, though. But, I mean, I understand why they're doing this. But, I mean, Ryuji's straight up Yosuke, in my mind at least. That being said, the Persona 5 protagonist is actually a lot more, animated and full of emotion to me than the protagonist was in Persona 4. Part of that is because of some of the animation and camera work that goes into a lot of the cutscenes. Your character just feels a little bit more alive and vibrant to me than in Persona 4. And this game having come out in 2016 in Japan, all the characters have smartphones. And so a huge part of the game is these text conversations you have with the various characters through their phones. I actually thought this was a great idea. At first I was thinking like, well, why didn't they just say this in person? Like, you went home at the end of the day and, somebody texts you to tell you a little bit more about what you were just talking about. I was thinking like they could have included that in that conversation at that point. But I do think that it, helps feel like things are moving along while still getting across a ton of dialogue, because these games have a lot of dialogue. Those parts obviously aren't voice acted, they're written. So that may have just been a clever trick on Atlus's part, to where they realized they could get more dialogue across without having to, necessarily up the voice acting too much. But it's really fun because they can interact with each other, like, for example, in the middle of class, and have a text conversation during class. And it just adds a new dynamic that I really actually enjoyed. You still get to choose, usually two options in the text conversations of what you could say. This also kind of illustrates the major difference between Persona 5 and Persona 4. Persona 4, coming from the previous generation, it was all about TVs and you accessed this other world through TVs. Persona 5 being for the current generation appropriately transitions that into smartphones. And this is sort of how you access the other world. And I love how integrated they feel into the entire experience. They're very, very important, and they're awesome tools to get to know the characters in a slightly different way than you might have otherwise. Something else that I love, and this isn't necessarily just unique to Persona 5, but the timed system. It's just so effective at building a sense of urgency. So for example, you have a deadline. You've got to figure this thing out before this date, or essentially you get a game over. I mean, the stakes are pretty high, right? I've been playing a lot of Breath of the Wild lately, and comparing Breath of the Wild's honestly lack of urgency most of the time to Persona 5's like really heightened sense of urgency, like constantly, it's actually refreshing. I really like knowing that, like, hey, what you're doing today has a consequence. That can be paralyzing for some people. I understand that feels a little like I want to do all these things and I'm being forced to choose just a few of those things. But I really appreciate that, having to make sacrifices and having time work against you. Now, something that Atlus added that I thought was a really cool touch was, if you hit the touchpad button on the PlayStation 4 controller, I don't know what that is on the PlayStation 3, but you get to see statistics on what other people have done on the specific day that you're experiencing. So, for example, you could hit that and it'll show you, okay, other players, 75% of them went into, the palace or whatever on this day, and then 10% of them went and interacted with confidants or whatever. You kind of get to see how people were breaking up their time, and then it'll also show you the average player level for that day down in the corner. And you can use this to kind of gauge your own progress and see, like, am I high enough level for what I need to be doing? And not only that, if you feel that kind of paralysis that comes with, like, what should I do first? I don't know. You can just whip this thing up, see what most people were choosing to do that day. And I don't know if you believe in the wisdom of crowds, just see, hey, 75% of people went straight to the palace today. You know what? That's just what I'm going to do then. I thought that was a really cool touch. Okay, speaking of the palace, dungeons in this game are a huge improvement over Persona 4. That was my least favorite part of Persona 4, hands down. I really didn't enjoy most of the time that I spent in dungeons. I was talking to somebody about them recently and mentioning how, the dungeons in Persona 4, they're randomly generated. It bothers me. They were telling me how, no, they weren't really randomly generated, but they did have a large set of them that would pick, one of them. And so they still had been designed, but I don't know, if you only went in a specific dungeon a couple times, they would feel random to you. That's done away with in Persona 5, thankfully. Atlus definitely listened to the feedback there. What they've added that's kind of made the dungeons more engaging are things like stealth elements, some platforming elements, that kind of make your experience there just feel a little less like you're just running through a maze, and a little more like you're kind of trying to figure out a big puzzle, kind of find the best way to approach situations. In Persona 4, I would constantly basically just run around until I found every room on a floor, every treasure chest, killed everything, and then I'd move on to the next floor because I didn't want to miss out on items. And that was really kind of a drag on that whole experience. Fortunately, I can say Persona 5 has has made a vast improvement in that whole department of the game. Something else I really enjoyed was the addition of the gun to the battle system. The gun is really cool because you have limited shots, a limited amount of ammo for the gun, and you kind of have to use them strategically. You can only refill it when you leave the dungeon. And so while you're there, you have to choose, do I want to use it on this guy and this guy? There are enemies that have essentially like gun elemental weaknesses, and so it's good to save for them. But there are different types of guns that kind of makes that, I don't know, there's more variety in that part of the battle system, and I really appreciate it. Another thing that I absolutely love is that they have reintroduced the negotiation system a la Shin Megami Tensei. So you're in the middle of a battle, and if you knock all of the enemies over that you're facing with critical hits or elemental weakness attacks, you can either initiate an all-out attack, same as in Persona 4, where everybody gets a turn to attack, or you can initiate what they call a hold up. That allows you to negotiate with a shadow that you've downed, and it kicks you into a little dialogue tree where you can request things from it, or so you might only get some gold out of it or something. But if you're lucky, you will get a new persona out of this. So this is different from Persona 4, where you were choosing the tarot cards randomly at the end of battles. I really like the conversations. It's a lot of fun. It's kind of a risky thing to do, though, because if you fail, not only did you not do any damage to the enemy that round, they get back up. They're not knocked down anymore. And so sometimes you have to decide, do I want to initiate an all-out, or do I want to try and get this particular persona that I want? This system should never leave the Persona series again. I think they need to keep it in. The negotiation system is amazing. All right, guys, you've heard some of the things that I like. Now it's time to talk about some of the things that I didn't like as much. First thing on that list is they've done this in a lot of video games, not only Atlus, but Nintendo and Breath of the Wild, they did this. But that old technique of cutting to black on action so that the action doesn't have to be animated. Like someone's eating food off a plate and they'll just show it, then, cut, and then cut back and the plate's empty. Like, oh, they ate the food. They do a lot of this in Persona 5. The animation, honestly, though, in Persona 5 is a huge step up from Persona 4. It's amazing. These sequences feel so much more full of life. And so for the most part, I can't be too hard on them because most things that wouldn't have been animated in Persona 4 are animated in Persona 5, but there's still a lot of those sequences where it's a cut to black and then it cuts back and, something has happened and they say that it happened, which is, I don't know, feels a little bit lazy, but when you're making a gigantic game, I understand cuts and decisions have to be made places. On the positive side, the camera moves around and in and out of scenes kind of a little more dynamically than we've seen before. It really makes the in-engine cutscenes feel a lot more powerful and cinematic. Not only that, but it actually helps bridge the gap between the in-game visuals and then the hand-drawn anime-style cutscenes that you'll get occasionally in the game. Normally, I'm not a fan of those, and the reason for that being that it breaks the experience. You see a character look one way, and then you see a character look kind of a different style in the animated sequence. This was particularly the case in Persona 4 Golden. I remember playing that, and sometimes the animated sequences would come up, and it's like, I guess that's Yukiko. I mean that is Yukiko, but she kind of looks different. I never understood why the styles didn't connect a little more closely. Fortunately, in this game, the animated sequences look, the character designs don't look like they were done by somebody else. It still looks very consistent. But what they've done with the other aspects of the game kind of make those sequences not feel so jarring when they do come up. Some games have just, like Chrono Trigger with the remakes and the animated sequences they had in Chrono Trigger, I could have done without that because you would see, the pixel art and then you would see a really detailed representation of something intense happening and then back to the pixel art. And all of a sudden, by contrast, the pixel art feels like, oh, man. Persona 5 really is the best that I've seen that type of integration handled. Okay, something else that I didn't really like too terribly much is that sometimes there aren't real choices to be made in the dialogue tree. Oftentimes there's only two choices for the protagonist to choose from, and they essentially amount to saying the same thing just with a different tone. You kind of get the same result no matter what. I understand why they've implemented it this way. I mean, it's an extremely narrative-driven game. The story is what it is for the most part, And so you can't have decisions. You can't give completely free rein to the player. But I mean, yeah, I don't know. It seems like most of the time you're engaging in a conversation, it's just to kind of help keep you hooked in, not that what you're saying is actually steering the conversation very far. There are obviously exceptions to that. There's a lot of important decisions to be made at key points in the game, but it's through most conversations. You get the sense that it's like, it doesn't really matter what I choose right now. Now, I say that, and it very well may be that some of these things that seem like very small decisions that aren't important actually maybe add up to something important in the end. These kinds of games have a way of surprising you. Okay, and this complaint is really just more about how the game, starts out in the tutorial phase, I guess you could say. Tutorials pop up quite frequently early on in the game. You'll meet someone new or unlock something, and then a tutorial will pop up on the screen. And it'll be a 2, 3, sometimes 4-page thing to flip through that you have to read that's going to explain some gameplay mechanic. And sometimes several tutorials will pop up in a row. You get, boom, tutorial, and okay, all right, I got that figured out. And then, boom, new tutorial, okay? And it feels a little bit jarring. It also feels kind of, it slows things down a little bit in the beginning. This game has a lot of different systems that you have to understand well, and there might just not be a good way around this. I also see that I do appreciate that what this approach does is it keeps the more like gamey parts out of the character's dialogue. Like, for example, a character in the world is not generally explaining a gameplay mechanic to you in a way that kind of like, breaks like, this is a game, you are playing a video game, kind of breaks into the story there. They don't really do that because they have these tutorial pop-ups. Occasionally as a character, it's like, hey, we need materials so that we can do such and such, but it works within like, they would have said that. What this does is it sort of like avoids the problem. For example, in Ocarina of Time, or a lot of Zelda games, you run into a character in the world and they're saying, hey, press Z to target me and talk to me. And it's like, what are they saying? They're telling you this is a video game. You are playing a video game. The tutorial prompts as they work in Persona 5 keep that from being like part of the in-world character dialogue. So I don't know. I feel kind of weird about it because I appreciate that it keeps it out of the world and the world can be what it is. But there are just a lot of them, a lot of tutorial prompts, and so many times where you'll get several tutorial prompts in a row that just, I know that's going to turn off some people. It's just going to be too dense. So we're going to talk a lot more about this game moving forward, but for right now, I just wanted to wrap up with my overall recommendation for the game. This game, I seriously could not recommend enough. You need to play it. I've really only played Persona 4. I'm not like a Persona diehard. I haven't gone through the entire series. But what Persona 5 is to me, it just feels, like a historical important moment in the history of JRPGs. I feel like they're pulling things off in this game that people have attempted and failed at before. I've really never cared more about characters in a video game than I have about characters in Persona 5. So guys, as the game is finally out and you guys finally get your hands on it, let me know what your thoughts are as you guys start diving into it. I'll see you guys in the comments, and I can't wait to talk about this more with you guys in the future. We'll see you next time.